Hey guys, my name is Tim Tugnacci, and in this video I'm going to show you how I made this workbench. The process was super straightforward, it was a lot of fun to build, and it's got a lot of extra features that I think is going to improve my workflow in the shop. I added casters underneath so I can easily move it around. It has a bottom shelf for storage. I added a caddy on the side for my glue bottles for easy access and organization, and some construction paper on the side that I can easily roll up over the top of the workbench if I'm doing glue ups or finishing a project. Again, this was a lot of fun. I'm really excited about the way it turned out and I can't wait to start using it. So let's just jump into the project and I'll show you how I made it. So before we start working on the new outfeed / assembly table for my table saw, we're gonna have to get rid of the one that I currently have in here. This thing was built like 15 years ago or so, but my dad had served its purpose. It's done a great job for what I've needed so far, but now that I got the new table saw, it's time to upgrade. So let's clean up the scrap wood pile underneath, take this thing apart, and we can make some room for the new one. Now let's get to work. The base frame and the legs were made from 7/8 foot 2x4s. The process was pretty much the same for each board. You trim a little off the end, you measure out your cut, and then you set up a stop block and repeat. I've got a link down below in the description to the SketchUp file I used for my cut list for reference if you want to check that out. Next, I took a few minutes and mapped out the placement for the support beams to make sure they were evenly spaced out. I also marked out my screw placement as well. You'll want to do this for two main reasons. One, because it just looks nicer, and two, it helps avoid any screws running into each other later on when connecting the legs. You'll see that in a minute. I used 2.5 inch long pocket hole screws for this project. No specific reason other than I like how they're designed to pull the pieces in together. I made sure to pre-drill and countersink for each screw as well. This right angle clamp came in handy during the assembly process to make sure everything was square. Also, the floor of my garage is not level at all, so try to find a flat spot to work on. These frames will eventually hold the plywood top and bottom shelf, so they'll need to lay somewhat flat on these 2x4s. This is what I meant earlier about the screw placement. I'm taking a few measurements and then transferring these marks over to the legs so when I attach them, they won't run into the screws on the frame. So I used my speed square to make sure the legs were perpendicular with the frame, but looking back at the footage I realized I only used it on the first leg, so do as I say and not as I do, I guess. So I guess I thought that if the leg piece was flush to the side and the bottom, it probably meant that it's at 90 degrees. But when I flipped over the bench, it rocked. So I'd like to think that it's because of my uneven floor. Who knows? And then I just repeated the same process for the bottom shelf. Yep, that's me running into another screw. Next it was time to install the casters, so I put them in place and then marked out the screw placements for these as well, trying to avoid all the other screws that are underneath it. Because of the dimensions that I used for the top and bottom shelf, I needed to break down 2 separate sheets of 3/4 inch plywood. Also, I thought I bought Baltic birch, but based on how thin the top veneer was and how easily it chipped out, I'm thinking it was something else. And in case you're wondering, I had these delivered and didn't actually pick them up myself. Along with the old workbench that my dad left me, he also left me this circular saw too. I'm not entirely sure how old it is, but the blade is always loose after a few times using it. So after this cut, I went online and ordered myself a new circular saw, which you'll see me using later on. I also came back and added a piece of tape over my cut line, which I forgot to do in the second sheet. You'll see the difference it makes. So once I had the top cut to its final dimensions, I marked out the screw placement, pre-drilled the holes, and then added a countersink before screwing it in from the top. And then I just repeated the same process for the bottom shelf as well, and when I took this over to the table saw, the cut was getting a little dicey at the end, so I shut off the saw and finished it off by hand. Next, I ripped down some poplar to add a trim along the edge of the top to hide the plywood layers. Is this necessary? Probably not, but does it make the workbench look better? I thought so. No! I purposely left these pieces a bit longer so I can come back with my flush trim saw to clean them up. So at this point the assembly of the workbench was done, and I really wanted to incorporate some sort of holder for a roll of, I don't know what you call it, construction paper, that I can roll up over the top of the workbench for doing glue ups and applying finish to projects. Oh, and next item on my to-do list is to fix my table saw sled since the runners didn't fit anymore. Or I can just wait until the winter to use it again. Turns out wood movement is a real thing. Who knew? And my bandsaw was giving me some issues as well, so I shut that off and finished the rest of the cut with my flush trim saw. Better safe than sorry. I clamped a scrap piece of 2x4 to the workbench so I can make sure the spacing was the same on each side. The next feature I wanted to add was a little shelf on the side to store my glue bottles. Oh, and there's my new circular saw. I contemplated leaving the screws visible in case I ever want to replace the top, but ended up filling them with some wood putty. If I ever need to replace them in the future, I'll find a way. Off camera, I sanded the top down to 220 grit and then applied 3 coats of polyacrylic, sanding in between each coat. And with that, the workbench was completed.